lot of PowerPoints. Yes, you've done those too. Podcasts, that's what I'm looking for. We will be offering points depending on which one you look at and do a small review over. So we will put that up in our assignments for you guys to get the details on, but know that that is a thing. All right, 5 to 10 points depending on what you're doing. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and get started here. So as you can see, we have our guest speaker on here today. So this is Lori Torrini. She is a wonderful person in the world of animal behavior and training. She's been at it for what, 30 plus years now, I believe. She's currently still working at Spirit Keeper Equine Sanctuary. It's a nonprofit and specializing again with animal training and animal behavior. In 2017, they made a small shift and started adding in snakes, which is really cool. So she has a lot of really, really cool things she's been able to get her snakes to cooperate with and everything. So she's going to show us about that today. So Lori, feel free to take it away.
Okay, thanks. Well, it's nice to be here again, even though it's kind of the middle of my night. I am working with a lot of snake species right now that are nocturnal. And so I typically sleep from about 4 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. And I'm in mountain time. So it's about 7:30 here now, a little after 7:30. So you guys are getting me to lecture in the middle of my night. So we'll see how this goes. And my snakes aren't even awake yet. Their lights and stuff aren't even on. And as I understand it, this is a zookeeping 101 class or an introduction to zookeeping class. Is that correct?
Introduction, it's principles of zoo science. So it's an overall introductory for zoo animal keeping, the ins and outs of what you're going to find with AZA and all that kind of stuff.
All right, great. Well, as you guys already know or will find out, animal training is a huge part of working in a zoo, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But first, I'm going to let you know who I am. I'm an animal trainer and behaviorist. I'm certified with the Certified Professional Dog Training Association, and I have a certificate in applied animal behavior from the University of Washington. I'm also a fear-free certified animal trainer, and my AAS is in zookeeping technology. Right now, I'm working with horses, dogs, cats, and snakes, but over the years, I've worked with all sorts of species, mostly livestock and other domestic species, but I have worked with a few wild animals. Let's get right into what is training. Now, this class is going to be an introduction to training and an introduction to some training principles. So it's kind of a hodgepodge, and I'm cramming a lot of information into an hour. And I know that you don't have this, at least not yet at West Liberty, but when I got my zookeeping degree, I had to take a whole semester of animal behavior and a whole semester of animal training. So you guys are getting an hour of just introductory animal training. So I'm going to go through it quickly, and please contact me if you have any questions about it. And I have a lot of videos on YouTube that are just free for you to watch. Some are short courses that are about 30 minutes long, and then others are just sessions with me and some of the animals. So feel free to watch those and then ask me questions if you have any. But training is basically guided learning, and that's the way that I really want you to think about it. I want you to think about what learning is and how learning is happening all the time, either formally or informally. And when we are training an animal, we're just guiding their learning in some way. So it isn't something that we're doing to an animal. It's something that we do in cooperation with the animal. So we're guiding these animals to learn behaviors that benefit us so that we can take care of them easier, and it benefits them so that they're able to interact with us and with visitors if they're at a zoo, or with veterinarians, or with whatever humans they have to interact with. And they can have less fear, anxiety, and stress because those behaviors are hopefully happening in a cooperative manner. And so we do this by reinforcing behaviors that we want the animal to repeat. And reinforcement is going to be a key term for this class and in your future going forward in the zoo world. So reinforcement is basically the animal's paycheck. It's basically a reward. And a reinforcer is something that follows the behavior that the animal is going to find desirable, rewarding, pleasurable, and to their liking. And anytime a behavior is reinforced, that behavior is likely to be repeated in the future. So just to put it simply, I said this already, learning is always occurring. It's something that happens even inadvertently when we don't mean for it to. So we want to be careful when we're interacting with animals that we're hopefully helping them learn things we want them to learn and not inadvertently learn things that we would rather they not learn. So animals are going to go towards things they like, and they're going to repeat behaviors that they found pleasurable or that had a pleasing outcome for them. And they're going to move away from things they don't like. And they're usually not going to repeat behaviors that weren't pleasurable for them or did not have a good outcome or positive consequence for them. So you are going to get whatever you reinforce, and that actually works with people too. So keep that in mind when you're interacting with other humans. If they find something reinforcing, they're likely to repeat the behavior that preceded it. So again, behavior that's reinforced is going to be repeated. And that is a really key concept for you guys as you learn what animal training is. So you need to start figuring out what's reinforcing for whatever learner it is that you're working with. And that is going to be different for each and every animal. So what's reinforcing or what's valuable for one animal may not be reinforcing for another animal. So for example, some horses might find apples or carrots reinforcing, and some may not like those at all. Some of the snakes might find it reinforcing to come out of their enclosures and have activity time on some type of an exercise station, and some may not find that reinforcing. They may find that very scary. So you need to figure out what your animals like and don't like. If any of you have dogs or you have trained your dog before, you probably know that some of them like certain treats and some of them don't like certain treats. And if you have more than one dog, they may find different things enjoyable. So remember, reinforcement is like getting a paycheck or a reward, and what you find rewarding might be different than what the person sitting next to you finds rewarding. So you also want to be very careful about inadvertently reinforcing behaviors that you don't want. And we accidentally do that sometimes. It's really common in dog training or with people who have pet dogs to accidentally reinforce behaviors they don't like, such as the dog begging at the table. If you give the dog some of your food even one time, that's reinforcing, and they're going to keep repeating that begging behavior. Now, I want to talk a little bit about why we train animals, because you might be thinking, well, you know, why do we bother training an animal? Why do we bother training a horse to allow us to voluntarily halter them when we can just go up to them and restrain them and put a halter on them? Why do we bother training a reptile to shift when we could just open their enclosure and grab them out? Well, cooperative behaviors improve animal welfare and improve keeper safety. And so it's really, really big in the zoo world, and it's becoming big in other aspects of the animal world, like in veterinary care, in research labs, and other venues to train cooperative behaviors. And that means that the animal is taught to participate in their own care, and they have the ability to consent to interact with you or not. And this is really, really effective in general keeping and veterinary care because it enhances communication. It builds trust and understanding between you and that animal. It absolutely reduces fear, anxiety, and distress, not only for the animal, because they understand what's happening and they're getting some choice and control over what's happening, but it should reduce your fear, anxiety, and distress too, because you have a way to effectively communicate and interact with that animal. And it definitely improves ease of care and increases safety, not only for you and the animal, but any other caretakers that are involved in whatever you're doing. And it improves welfare. It gives the animal enrichment in the form of physical exercise and mental stimulation. It increases resiliency because the animal is learning how to generalize behaviors in all sorts of different circumstances. And so they become a more confident animal, and they become more resilient to changes that happen in their environment. It gives the animal a way to consent to interacting with you or not, and just improves choice and control. And several studies have shown that when animals have a perception of some control, that they actually have reduced stress and better welfare. So even if that is offering them options within their habitat space, if you have a habitat space where an animal is just caged, and if you think of old zoos where they had a concrete floor and a cage and bars, and you may have seen old videos of animals just pacing or doing other stereotypies like head shaking or vocalizing or pawing or swaying or biting at the bars, but pacing is a big one. It's because the animals don't have any choices even within that habitat. But now if you give the animal a designated resting area, and maybe you give them something to climb on, you give them an elevated surface, maybe you give them a den that they can get into. Or with cats and snakes, if you give them a hide box, if you give them something to climb on, they have options even within their habitat. So they can think to themselves, well, I can go up and I can get on that elevated ledge, or I could go and hide in this box, or I could go over here and I can get a drink. So even those small changes to the habitat gives the animal options and choices, and they can make decisions within that space. So when we're training an animal to do behaviors like shift in and out of their habitats, station on a scale or an exam table, it gives them choices and a perception of control, and it improves their welfare. There are other reasons that we train animals. One would be for education. So if you end up working in a zoo or another similar animal facility, like maybe a sanctuary, you're probably going to have to do keeper talks. You're going to educate the public about that animal, maybe about your facility. And so if the animals are trained, when you interact with them during those keeper talks, it's going to be a lot more interesting for visitors to see. And then we train animals for conservation. And that is a form of remote training. Ken Ramirez does quite a bit of this, and he's got some articles and some talks that he's done about it. And so, for example, in order to prevent elephants over in Africa from getting poached, some of their migration routes go through areas that are outside of the countries they're protected. They might go just over the border, and it's common for the poachers to wait in those areas. So in conservation training, they actually use something called remote training to train the animals to alter their migration route so that they don't go through those areas that are unprotected and where poachers might be. And so that's a way that training is used in conservation. And that's just one example. The Eastern Indigo Project here in the United States is another way that animals are trained for conservation. So the Eastern Indigo snake is an endangered species, and there's a reintroduction program that the Orion Center for Indigo Research does in cooperation with some universities. And so they actually train those snakes under captive management for things that they're going to need in order to survive once they get released. And that's another way it's used in conservation. So training can be used in research, both to do the research and also to train the animals so that they can willingly participate in that research. Obviously, it's used in entertainment and sports. And for work, in some cases, animals are still used in the workplace. And I'm sure that you could think of other reasons that people train animals. And it's also really, really fun to train an animal. And it's very rewarding when you develop a level of communication with an animal so that they understand what you want, and you actually understand when they're telling you, yes, I'll participate, or no, I'm not, or I want to do this in a different way. It's really fun. It is part of a zookeeper's job to do animal training. At most zoological facilities, part of your duties are going to be training animals and some type of behavior, and sometimes even research into behavior. And this is just an example from the St. Louis Zoo's website, and they are an AZA accredited institution. So especially at any institution that's accredited with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, training is going to be some component of what you do there. And this is what the St. Louis Zoo says on their website. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You guys can read this, and I will make sure that your instructors have a copy of these slides. I know they have a copy of the slides from last time. I changed these just a little bit to try to make it more concise and fit into the time limit that you have today. But the animals at the St. Louis Zoo are trained through positive reinforcement. The animals are voluntarily participating in things like doctor's visits and general housekeeping in their area. And the rewards that they get for that might be food, it might be freedom to engage in an activity, it might be other things that they find reinforcing. And training allows keepers and veterinarians to do their jobs more safely and easily, and it allows the animals to receive the best care possible through their own willing involvement in the process. So training is often done to perform husbandry tasks, but it's also very enriching for the animals because it provides a challenge for them and offers them the opportunity to earn a reward that they find very worthwhile. It is becoming vital in animal care in more institutions than just zoos. I use it all the time here at our animal sanctuary. I use it with my own personal pet animals, and I definitely use it in the research that I do with the reptiles. Here are some ways that training can be conducted, and I've got some photographs here to illustrate this. So it can be conducted through free contact, semi-protected contact, protected contact, or remotely. So I'll go over these briefly. This is a concept that is from the zoo world, and free contact means that you're engaging with that animal just freely, you're sharing the same space and there's no barriers. So in this picture of me with the wolf and the picture of me with the dogs, that is an example of free contact. We are just together sharing the same space. And then there is semi-protected contact, which you see in the picture on the lower right with me and the snake. So that snake shifted out of its enclosure and targeted through that tub, which is semi-protected contact. So the snake's head is on one side and the snake's tail is on the other side. So the side where the snake's head is, it is stationed at a target. Its head is on a blue target disc. And then the backside of the snake is getting an injection. And that semi-protected contact will keep the person doing the injection safe if for some reason the snake gets startled and whips its head around to strike or see what's going on. And then protected contact is in this photo example from the St. Louis Zoo. And that's where the keeper and the animal are completely separated from each other by a barrier. So they can't get to each other at all. They're not sharing any of the same space. And then remote training, I already talked about when I mentioned conservation. And remote training is when an animal is trained and the keeper is not visible or the trainer is not visible. So something is done to manage the environment, to train those animals, either with a remote controlled device or just by setting up the environment in a certain way so that you are training the animals to do a certain behavior, but you're out of the picture. They don't realize that you are part of that process. That is done a lot in conservation training or with wildlife populations, where you're training those wild animals to do things, but they don't even see the human because you don't want them to become habituated to people. So you want them to learn behaviors without seeing you. If you notice in all of these photos, the animals have the option to move away at any time, and the human has the option to move away at any time. So their presence and proximity to humans in all of these circumstances is voluntary. And it's really interesting to note that in this photo from the St. Louis Zoo, that polar bear could just turn around and go back into its habitat. The human couldn't follow it. And if the human walked away, or something went amiss, the polar bear can't get to the human. So this is still completely voluntary, and these behaviors are consensual because both parties, the keeper and the animal, can disengage at any time and are free to leave. They don't have to be engaging in this activity. Let's talk a little bit about some terms because these are going to be important for you to understand when we talk about training and behavior. So behavior is anything observable an animal does. So if an animal is just resting, apparently doing nothing, it is still behaving because it is doing something. Even inaction is a type of behavior. And the environment is all aspects of an individual and their surroundings. So the environment can be everything going on with that animal internally or externally, and everything around the animal, including you if you're in their environment. A stimulus is anything that influences behavior. So that can be an event, it can be the environment itself, it can be the animal's internal state, so how they're feeling, what they're thinking, and it can be a condition. or something that you place on the animal. And that really comes into play when we talk about training, is we establish conditions that if the animal does this, then something else happens. And that shaping is something that you hear a lot in training. You'll hear a shaping plan or shaping a behavior. And that is just gradually reinforcing each step of a goal behavior until that ultimate behavior is reached. A few more terms that are really important to understand is an antecedent. So antecedents are whatever conditions immediately precede a behavior that are functionally related to that behavior occurring. So it's a type of environmental stimuli that as a trainer, we set up on purpose so that we can help that animal become successful in learning that behavior that we want them to. A consequence is something that happens right after a behavior. So basically it's the result of our behavior. It's the result of the animal's behavior is a consequence. And that consequence can have a positive or negative emotional valence for us or the animals. And consequences that are positive are going to cause the behavior that preceded it to be repeated. And usually consequences that are negative are going to cause the behavior that preceded it to be reduced or not happen again at all. Learning is a process through which an experience alters an individual's behavior in the future. So we are learning all the time, and animals are learning all the time. And if through that learning, we learn, through that learning is how we figure out what behaviors we want to repeat or not. And we learn how to adapt our behavior in order to be more successful in life and the things we're trying to accomplish, and animals are no different. So this is what allows organisms to adapt and progress and survive as circumstances change. And if animals weren't able to adapt and learn, then they wouldn't survive very long in the wild, and they wouldn't function very well under captive management. And then an experience is anything that occurs within the animal or outside of the animal in their immediate surroundings or environment. So an experience could be how the animal is feeling, if they're sick or ill, or they're having an emotional experience. And then experiences obviously are anything that's going on in the environment that relates directly to that animal. These are some of the guiding principles that I want you to remember in regards to animal training, or these should be some of your guiding principles. The animals always come first. So when we think about a training session, if the animal just isn't in the mood, if the animal's not feeling well, also in ambassador animal programs, we want to try to give the animals as much choice and control over whether they participate or not. Because if we don't put the animals first, they're going to start having a negative emotional association with whatever's happening, and they're going to be less engaged to participate in programs or in training in the future. You want to make sure that you keep it fun for the trainer and for the learner, and you want to communicate not only with your learner, but with other trainers or other keepers or anyone else involved in that animal's care or involved in whatever you're doing with that animal. So that might be a veterinarian. It might be a farrier if you're doing hoof trims. It might be anybody, a researcher, anybody that is going to be in that animal's environment. You want to make sure you're communicating with them. You want to train core behaviors that are going to lay a foundation for future behaviors that you want the animals to do. So for example, targeting might be a core behavior. If the animal learns to follow a target and do that simple action of following a target or touching a target, then you can use that behavior to teach them to do other things in the future. So if they can follow a target from one side of their habitat to the other, you can then use that behavior to teach them to follow the target out of their habitat and follow the target onto a scale and follow the target onto a station and to do other things. So targeting would be considered a core behavior. It's always good if you can also establish an anchor behavior for a particular learner. So I'm thinking of some of the anchor behaviors that some of the animals I work with here have learned. So for one of the dogs I work with, an anchor behavior for her is sitting. Anytime things are going awry or she gets confused or I need to refocus her, I ask her to sit, because that's a super simple behavior that she's good at and she learned and sometimes does on her own. And it's a behavior that is an anchor behavior for her. For some of the horses I work with, leading exercises, and that's like maybe walking next to me, backing up when I back up, halting when I halt, whether they're haltered or not is an anchor behavior for some of them. For some of the horses, putting their feet on a platform is an anchor behavior. For some of the dogs, lying down is an anchor behavior. So you just need to figure out a good anchor behavior for whatever animal you're working with. I have taught anchor behaviors to some of the snakes. So I know some of the individual snakes and what their anchor behaviors are. One of the snakes, our reticulated python, will station on the scale and sometimes even go to the scale station when he becomes nervous or unsure of what else to do. He'll go to the scale station and sit on the scale. That's an anchor behavior for him. So you want to individualize the training for each learner if you haven't figured that out yet. It's not a cookie cutter process. The animals aren't robots and neither are we. And so we interact with each learner on a very individual basis, and each trainer may interact with the individual learners a little differently. As you're working with animals and guiding them to learn, or as you're working with animals and trying to accomplish husbandry behaviors or medical behaviors, you want to think, what is the least intrusive, minimally aversive way that I can train this behavior or help this animal learn to do something? And then you want to think, what is the least intrusive, most effective way that I can accomplish this care task I need to accomplish? So for example, if I have a dog that will voluntarily station on a scale, or any animal that will voluntarily station on a scale, that is very, very minimally intrusive to just cue them to get on the scale. I don't have to even touch them. But if I have an animal that hasn't learned that behavior yet, and they have to be weighed because they have to be given medication, that's sort of an emergency, then I may have to pick them up and put them on the scale, or I might have to put them in a carrier and put the carrier on the scale. So for one animal, the least intrusive, most effective way to weigh them is just to cue them to get on the scale. And for another animal, the least intrusive, most effective under those circumstances might be to pick the animal up and put them on the scale. So this is also something that's going to be individualized based on the animal's level of training and how important is it that that behavior get done or not? Is it an emergency or not? Is it something that can't wait, or can it wait until the animals had a little more training? Hopefully this video is plain. This just shows voluntary or a consent behavior of haltering a horse through protected contact. So that horse is free to leave at any time. It did not have to stick its head through the barrier. It did not have to stay there. It has that's a 1/4 acre paddock, and he could have gone off and left at any time. And even now that I'm opening the gate, he looks back. So he could have walked away, or he could have come with me through the gate to engage in the activity we're doing, and he chooses to engage. So that is an example of a consent behavior. At no point in that process was the horse forced to be there, forced to allow me to halter him, or forced to come through that gate. That was a behavior that was voluntary on his part. We're going to talk just briefly about how learning works. And I want you to think about the ABCs. So the A in this sequence is the antecedent, or the stimulus that precedes a behavior. That's what we do, or whatever happens in the environment that stimulates that animal to do a behavior in the first place. And then the animal does a behavior. And then there's a consequence to that behavior. And when the consequences are favorable, that behavior is likely to be repeated. And if the consequences are not favorable, then that behavior is not likely to be repeated. So if I'm hiking and I've never encountered a mud puddle before, and I just keep hiking right through the mud puddle and I slip and fall, that was not a favorable consequence. And so the next time I go hiking and I see a mud puddle, I'm not likely to walk through it again. I walk around the mud puddle and I don't fall, and I continue my hike and I have a great day. And so that's the behavior I'm likely to repeat. It's really as simple as that. And as trainers, we want to guide this process for the animals. We want to make sure that the consequences for behaviors we want the animals to do again are favorable. And we don't necessarily want to deliberately make consequences unfavorable when the animals do a behavior we don't want. That's called punishment. And I try to use positive reinforcement whenever possible in training. I'll talk a little bit about that here at the end. But we basically want to reinforce behaviors we want repeated and ignore behaviors, as long as it's safe, to ignore the behavior that we don't want repeated. Because if the animal's not getting reinforced for a behavior, it usually extinguishes, it usually stops or goes away, and they're going to repeat behaviors they get reinforced for. So here's an example. This is just a picture of a baby corn snake that I worked with. The antecedent is the target being presented, and it's a cue to the animal. They're not going to know that initially. There's a process we go through to load this cue. If you've ever done clicker training and you've been taught to load the clicker by clicking the clicker and giving treats immediately after, targeting is kind of the same way. You start by pairing the target with food enough times until the animal sees the target and responds to just the target, knowing that it's associated with food, and you just build up behavior that way. So the snake sees the target, it orients towards the target. So it just looks at the target or moves towards it. And then you deliver the reinforcement, which in this case was food. And so how is this practical? I'm going to show you a video here of how orienting towards the target has a practical use. So this is a baby corn snake in this tank. She was in a hide. I'm asking her to come out of her hide. I'm then asking her to come up and out of her tank and to shift onto the scale station. And she's doing that, utilizing this targeting behavior that we built on. So when I first taught this behavior, I just paired the target with food several times. Then I showed her the target and gave her the food when she looked at it. Then I would show her the target and give her the food when she moved towards it. And then I showed her the target and would give her the food when she followed it a short distance, until we worked up to her following the target completely out of her hide, out of her tank, and over onto the scale station to get reinforced. So now she's totally out of her tank. She's on a scale and can be weighed, and I can safely clean her tank or rearrange furnishings. And all of this was done safely and without stress to me and without stress to the animal. So imagine how that might have looked differently if I stuck my hands in the tank and I took the hide off the snake and I grabbed her out of there. You can imagine that that would be extremely frightening for the animal, and that she might react defensively. She might either exhibit escape and avoidance behavior and try to get away. And snakes can be darty, so she could have flown out of the enclosure and onto the floor, or she could have gotten scared and defensive and struck at me. But this way, it was really smooth sailing and there was no stress for me or her. And it was very safe. And you will see this shifting behavior all the time in zoos, where wild animals are being shifted on and off exhibit, or onto scales, or into chutes where veterinary procedures are done. And it's very, very minimally stressful for the animals and keepers when animals consent to these types of behaviors. Here's another example. So the antecedent in this case is I present an open carrier for this dog, Luna, when she was a puppy. And when she enters the carrier, she gets reinforced with a treat. And so the predicted future behavior, because we did this when she was small and we built up the steps when she was just learning, is that she is going to enter the carrier voluntarily as an adult. And that's exactly what happens. So this photo on the left is puppy Luna. She got reinforced with a favorite food while she would sit in her carrier at the vet and not whine and not try to escape from the carrier. And then as an adult, she can now generalize this behavior in all sorts of circumstances. So when we're at a training class, when we're at maybe a nose work competition, whatever it is, or when we're at the vet when she's an adult, she can generalize this behavior because we established it at an early age. So how do you get started with these things? It's really neat and it's really cool to be able to do things with animals, but how do you make this happen? Well, you start with the learner, and you have to start with gathering some knowledge about your learner. What is the learner's natural history and biology, and what is their individual history? So it's helpful for me to know, if you look at this snake in the photo, this is a Morelia Bredli They're from the area around Alice Springs, Australia. They're a semi-arboreal species. They're a sister taxon to carpet pythons or Morelius spilotus. So they do spend quite a bit of time climbing. So it is helpful for me to design a scale station when I want to weigh them that is something that they can climb onto and wrap their body around, because that's a natural behavior that they're going to feel comfortable doing. If it's a burrowing species, you can create a burrowing box with some substrate in it that you can sit on the scale so they feel more comfortable about shifting onto that scale. If it's a dog or a horse or another type of ungulate, you just want to make sure that that scale has some non-slippery surface on it so that when they step onto it, they feel secure and comfortable. So you need to know things about your individual learners, natural history and biology. And then it's helpful if you can know something about that individual learner's history with people. So how has that animal interacted with people in the past? If they came from another facility, do they have any prior training? Have they had any prior negative experiences that you know of, so that maybe you want to avoid certain things that you already know they're afraid of? Or are there certain things that another trainer or another keeper can tell you that animal really enjoys so that you can incorporate those in your training plan? So you've got the learner, and then you've got the trainer, and presumably that's going to be you or other keepers. And as the trainer, you want to be patient, you want to be prepared, and you want to be flexible. You have to be able to adapt your training plan as circumstances change, because you're working with another living thing, and you might have this plan in place, but it might not go exactly as you want it to, because you're dealing with another living organism that is going to have behaviors that come up that you didn't expect, or maybe do something that you didn't expect. So just be flexible. And then you're going to have tools of the trade that you're going to want to incorporate into your training plan or your shaping plan. You're going to want to have a safe location. You're going to want to have whatever equipment you're going to need to train that behavior. So if we go with this picture I have, what equipment did I need? Well, I needed a scale, and that white thing underneath the station is just a baby scale. It's a digital scale that you would weigh a baby in or another small animal. And then the scale station is something that I put on there that the animal feels comfortable on. You're going to need to arrange the antecedents appropriately. So where are you going to put the station in relation to the animal's habitat? Or where are you going to put that scale so it's easy for the animal to step up onto it? If you're trying to transport an animal, where are you going to put that carrier or that horse trailer or that cart so that the animal can shift out of their habitat easily onto that transport device? So you want to just think about how you're going to arrange the antecedents or the environment. What cues are you going to use with that learner? Are you going to use voice cues, hand signals, a target? And then what reinforcement are you going to use with that individual? These are all things that need to go into your shaping plan or your training plan. So you can get the desired behavior you want in the first place by one of several ways. You can capture the behavior. Capturing the behavior means if I happen to see my dog sit on their own, I run over there real fast and I give them a treat. And then next time I see the dog sit on their own, I run over there and give them a treat. So that's capturing a behavior. That means the animal just does a behavior on their own at random that you know you're going to want to put on cue at a later time. And so you start reinforcing that behavior when they just do it. Prompting the behavior is when you do something to prompt the behavior. So if I want an animal to move from one location to another, I might do something to sort of give them a push in the right direction. So I might hold treats in my hand and stand in a location to get that animal to come to me. Or maybe, and zoos used to do this a lot more, it's not really acceptable anymore. Maybe I spray a hose in the location the animal's in to prompt them to move to the other side of the habitat. And that's a form of punishment. So we generally want to stay away from that. But of course, in an emergency, you can prompt behaviors that way. And then luring is a way that you can get an animal to do a behavior. So if I want a dog to sit, I might hold a treat above their nose and keep moving it back and back and back until, in order to still follow that treat with their nose, they have to sit. Or I might put a treat in front of a horse's mouth, like a carrot, and then I might back up And so in order for them to get that carrot, they have to come towards me. So that's a form of luring. Physical molding is another way that you can shape a behavior. This is less common, and that's where you're going to physically touch the animal to put their body in the position you want it to be in. So back to our example with the dog and sitting, I might push on their hips to get them to sit. And then free shaping is where you're going to wait for the animals to do something close to the behavior you want, and you're going to reinforce that. And then you're going to tighten up the criteria until the animal is doing the behavior that you want. And then modeling is a form of animal training where the animal is actually copying what you or another animal does. There's actually a whole form of dog training called do as I do, where you do a behavior and then the animal copies you. But animals can learn socially, so they can watch other animals do a behavior and then they can copy that behavior. And you can use that sometimes to your advantage when you are training an animal. So these are just all options that can help you get that behavior initially. You can get that behavior going in the first place and put it on cue. So once an animal is performing a behavior, then you can start introducing a cue. So you teach the animal, or you start reinforcing the sit. And then once the animal's sitting a lot, then you start pairing that sit with a cue. So either a voice command or a hand signal or some other cue that's going to mean sit. And so cues can be visual, auditory. You can use scent as a cue, like smells. But you need to know how your individual learner perceives the world. So whatever species you're working with, you need to know what sensory modalities do they use to interact with their environment, and which of those do they use most prevalently. So is your animal very visual? So can you use visual cues with the animal? Or do they not have very good vision, or maybe the animal's blind? And you're going to need to use an auditory cue, like your voice or a whistle or a sound. Or maybe you're going to use a smell or a scent to cue a behavior. All of those things are appropriate cues, but you need to know how your learner perceives the world and what's going to work best for them. So visually, orally, through olfaction, through touch, through chemoreception, thermally, you're just going to have to research your species and figure that out. And you also want to keep in mind what things they find aversive. So some animals you can use touch as a cue, but if an animal is aversive to being touched, you wouldn't want to use that as a cue in your training. And then some smells are aversive to certain species. So you wouldn't want to, citrus, for example, cats find citrus unpleasant. So you wouldn't want to use citrus as an olfactory cue. If you were training a cat, you would want to use a scent that is more pleasurable to them. So you're going to have to do a little research on the species that you're working with first. But examples of cues are hand signals, a target, a light. I have a flashlight that I use as a cue for some animals, especially if your animal is deaf and can't hear, or hearing isn't one of their stronger senses. You might want to use a visual cue or a light. A station itself can be a cue. You can use a whistle. Lots of things can be used as cues. And I'm going to show you a video here, and hopefully the sound works in it, because you're going to hear and see some cues in this video. So for that behavior, I used a hand signal and a voice cue to get the dog to come. And then I used a hand signal when he got to me in order to ask him to sit in front of me. This picture at the bottom is just some examples of some targets. And I don't use targeting very much with dogs and horses, but you'll see targeting used a lot with wild animals in zoos. I do use targeting extensively for the reptiles, specifically snakes, and then for cats. Cats, I've learned, are pretty good at targeting. Okay, here is a sample shaping plan or training plan, or what that might look like. So there's a worksheet pictured here in the top right, and you're going to just write down who your learner is and what they are. So in this sample, I've got a female false water cobra and her name is Vashti. You may just have a number designation if the animals aren't individually named. You're going to have the trainer's name. You're going to have the location of the training. You're going to have what equipment you're going to need for that training. And then you're going to jot down what your environment's going to look like, or what your antecedent arrangement's going to be like before you start that training. So for this false water cobra, the training was in the Northwest Snake Room at Behavior Education. That's here. And it was her habitat and the adjacent space. And then the equipment was a target, a crate, food, and a table. And then the antecedent arrangement for her was to place a table flush with her habitat opening, and to place her crate or her shift box on the table with the door facing her habitat opening. And then to arrange the habitat doors as barriers on either side of the crate. And then open the top of the crate, keeping the lid nearby, and opening the front of the crate. And you'll see this behavior in a video in a second. But if you look at this behavior with the dogs that's pictured, think of how you would write a shaping plan in order to get this behavior. We've got 4 dogs and they're each individually stationed. So what are some things that you see in this picture that you would need for equipment? What cues might you be using? What antecedent arrangement might you have? And then how would you shape this behavior where you've got 4 dogs stationing at once? And I can tell you, I do have a video about this. Most of the videos on my channel are about snakes, because that is really a big hole in the training community is reptile training. And most of my viewers are coming to my channel because they are hungry for information about how to train snakes and other reptiles. But I also do training with other animals. And I do have this video where I show how to train multiple animals to do a behavior and get them to station at once. So this is a sample plan as far as how the approximations or the steps in the plan are going to look. So the learner eats the food when it's paired with the target. And then the learner is subsequently, during subsequent sessions, reinforced for first orienting towards the target, and then moving towards the target, and then touching the target, and then following the target. So during each session, or as the learner progresses, you're going to make the criteria more difficult. You're going to make them do more and more to earn the reinforcement each time. And that's what shaping is. So the learner is reinforced for generalizing behavior eventually. And so once the learner has learned to follow the target, then you can teach them to do things like follow the target out of hiding, change directions, go to various locations within the enclosure, and then to the enclosure door, and then out of the enclosure, and then into a crate or onto a scale. So the learner shifts from the habitat to a crate and back if we're following this shaping plan that I've written up for the snake. And then again, if you look at this picture on the right, now I've got 2 different species stationing on platforms. And so just think about what are all the incremental steps that you would reinforce to get these 2 animals to do this behavior. So first I might reinforce them just sitting individually and then sitting next to each other. And then I might reinforce them getting near the platform. And then I might reinforce them touching the platform. And then I might reinforce them putting one paw on the platform until we're working up to both animals sitting on the platform next to each other. So this is a video of that behavior with the false water cobra that I just went over in that previous shaping plan. So here you can see that I've got her shift box set up as I described in the training plan. I'm showing her the target and I'm asking her to follow the target out of hiding, out of her enclosure, and into the shift box. And this is one of the snakes that was bred there at West Liberty University by Dr. Loafman and his students. And she was sent here for a coaching project I did with one of your grad students. So I was working with this snake here at our facility, and she was working with several false water cobras there at West Liberty. And I was able to meet with her weekly and help coach her in that project. And then this is her shifting back. So I've cleaned the enclosure and now the animal needs to be able to shift back. And so she follows the target back into her enclosure and she gets reinforced for that. And this shifting behavior is one of the critical behaviors that most animals in zoos are taught to do. So when you're working with a wild animal that you can't put a leash and collar on or a halter and lead back and forth, you're going to want them to voluntarily shift on and off exhibit in and out of crates, etc. It makes things so much easier. Okay, so you made it this far. We've got about 8 minutes left, so I'm going to go over some concepts and a little bit of training theory with you, and then I'll have some time at the end for questions. So I want to go over what positive and negative reinforcement is and what positive and negative punishment is. And I'm going to go over this just real quickly because you're going to see this if you are in training courses. If you watch training videos, you're going to see these things maybe written this way. R plus and R minus means positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And P plus and P minus means positive punishment and negative punishment. So I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible because these words, negative and positive, are used differently in popular culture than they're used in training. So anytime something is reinforcing, that means that it has positive emotional valence for the animal and that there's a pleasing outcome and the behavior that preceded it is likely to be repeated. So anytime an animal keeps repeating a behavior, they are finding it reinforcing in some way. They're finding it pleasurable. Positive reinforcement means the animal is getting something for that behavior. They're getting a treat. They're getting scratches. They're getting something they find enjoyable added to them, added to their environment. And the best way to think about that is you go to work and you receive a paycheck. So you get money for doing work. You're being given something. So you're positively reinforced. Negative reinforcement is when we take something away, and by taking that thing away, it improves the animal's experience. And I don't use this a lot because inherently something negative or something with negative emotional valence has to be happening first. So let's think of an emergency situation. And we've had this happen here at our sanctuary. We have a horse that's got their leg caught in a wire fence. That's a bad experience for them. It's painful. And they're thrashing a lot. And we approach them and we need to get the wire from around their leg. And they're thrashing and thrashing and thrashing, and we can't get to them. But they stop thrashing and we cut the wire off their leg and they're able to stand up. And now they're comfortable and I give them water and food and they're happy. So that's negative reinforcement because I took the aversive away and that was a positive experience for the animal. So in order to use negative reinforcement deliberately in training, typically we have to take something away from the animal that was bad or that they didn't like in the first place. So if the animal's too hot and we take the heat away, that's negative reinforcement. Or if the animal is thirsty, well, no, that's not a good example. Negative reinforcement is tricky, but you're taking something away in order to improve the animal's experience. And they find that reinforcing. And so they're going to repeat whatever behavior they did right before. So if they're too hot and you take the heat away, they're going to repeat whatever behavior they did just before you took the heat away because they associate it with something that had positive emotional valence. So negative reinforcement just means you're taking something away, but by taking that away, the animal finds it reinforcing. So anytime an animal likes something, it's reinforcing. Now let's punishment. Positive punishment's easy to understand. That is, we use physical force. I punch you in the face, I grab you, I pick the animal up. All of that is, or the dog's got a collar on and I do a leash tug and I jerk the collar. All of that is positive punishment because I'm doing something to the animal that they find aversive, that they find that has negative emotional valence. It's bad for them and they don't like it. So it's likely they're not going to repeat whatever behavior came right before that. Negative punishment, I do use occasionally in training, and that is I'm taking something away from the animal as a punishment. So for example, let's say that a dog is resource guarding their crate and they're chewing on a stuffed chew toy. They're chewing on a Kong with peanut butter in it. And they're growling at handlers or other dogs when they come near the crate. So I'm going to take that Kong away from them in order to hopefully reduce the growling. So I'm taking away something as a punishment. If a snake is out using an exercise space here, like a climbing area, and they leave the exercise space and they go into an off limits area, and I pick them up and I put them back into their habitat, I took away their freedom, and they found that punishing. And so they're less likely to leave that exercise space next time. And so just remember that if you're adding something in training, it's considered positive. And if you're taking something away in training, it's considered negative. But that positive or negative can be something good, or it can be something bad. And the animal decides what is reinforcing for them or not. And the animal decides what's punishing for them or not. So some animals might find it reinforcing to be taken out of their habitat and allowed to utilize an exercise space or engage in training. And other animals might find that punishing because it scares them. I know that that's complicated, and I went over it really quickly, and it takes a lot of people, sometimes a while, to grasp this concept of these 4 quadrants of reinforcement and punishment. But please just remember that if an animal repeats the behavior, then whatever the consequence was, they found reinforcing. And then if an animal does not repeat a behavior or doesn't do a behavior in the first place, then they're finding whatever that consequence of that behavior is as punishing. So hopefully I didn't confuse you too much about that. We're at about an hour, and I do have additional slides that may or may not be in the handout you get, because this typically is a longer course. The additional slides are stuff about classical and operant conditioning, some laws of learning, how motivation plays into training. So I'm happy to give these slides to your instructor if you think that those are beneficial to you. I'm happy to come back and go over those slides in another class. But I usually end it here because I really think that's a lot of information, especially if you've never been exposed to animal training before and never heard some of these concepts. And I want to make sure that I have time to answer questions.
I think that's perfect. We'll definitely take those slides. They can read them if they want to.
Okay, so what I'll do is, because I modified this a little bit based on how last year went, I'll save these as a PDF and I will send them to your instructor when we're done here this morning.
Beautiful. All right, guys. So who has questions? Because we're not going to be shy on this Tuesday morning. So any kind of questions about training, about any particular animal she's worked with, how to get a behavior out of an animal that you've been curious about trying to train, anything. Go ahead.
What happens if you feed them too much for the training? Would you have to stop training them for a while?
So the question was, what happens if you feed them too much for training? Would you have to stop training them for a little?
So one of the things that's important when you research the natural history of your animal is obviously to know what their normal diet is. And typically, if you know you're going to be training an animal, you will use part of their normal daily ration of food in the training, as well as some really special, super great treats that they love. If an animal becomes satiated during the training session and they no longer want to work for food, if that's what you're using as a reinforcer, then that's time to end the session. But you can teach animals to find other things besides food reinforcing. So especially with animals who may have a natural history where they don't eat a lot, like dogs are easy because they're pretty much going to just keep eating as many treats as you give them, even sometimes if they've had a full meal before the training session. And you also, it's really important that you're not withholding their normal diet. If the animal doesn't want to engage in training today, you're still going to feed them their normal diet. They're just not going to earn it through the training session. So you don't want to deprive the animal of food or their normal diet. But if you're working with cats, for example, they tend to get satiated very quickly. And so you want to make sure that your training plan takes that into account. And so that you plan the number of repetitions based on how many times you think that they're going to accept the treats. With reptiles, like with snakes, who normally eat maybe once a week, some species may only eat once every couple of weeks or once a month. they have really good associative learning capabilities. So even though that latency period between sessions might be long, they remember from one time to the next what they trained. But in order to maximize your sessions, if there's going to be a long latency period in between, you can divide up the meal. So like for the snakes, if a snake would normally eat a medium rat for a normal meal, I might give them 3 rat pups during the session, or 4 rat pups, so that I can do 4 repetitions during the session. And I'm not overfeeding them. I'm not feeding them more than their normal diet, and I'm not feeding them more often. I'm just dividing their meal into smaller pieces during the session so I can get more repetitions in. If you can teach animals to find other things reinforcing, or they might show you that they find other things reinforcing, so you're not always having to use food. I have some snakes that will do behaviors if they're going to get freedom to explore and roam around an exercise space after. And I do use a different target when that is going to be the reinforcement given versus when I'm using food. With some animals, you might find that tactile reinforcement works great. Like some of the horses, I can reinforce them by scratching them in certain places instead of giving them food, and they will work for that reinforcement. They will work for those scratches. And so you can experiment with that with your learners, but you also absolutely need to research your learner's natural history and find out, make a list of different things that they might find reinforcing, and then do some preference testing. And scientific preference testing is something that you can do to figure out what your animal's preferences are. And there are a few articles in the scientific literature about how to systematically do that.
Who else has one? Anything you want. Go ahead.
What happens when you're trying to teach a behavior for like veterinary care and like the animal does not want to do it at all? Like, how do you try to figure that out?
So the question was, what happens when you're trying to train something for veterinary care and the animal doesn't want to participate at all? How do you?
Yes. So remember that you're working up to the goal behavior. So hopefully, so you aren't going to just train a behavior the night before they need a procedure. And that's why training in the animal's daily lives is so important. And you want to try to anticipate, okay, what might this animal have to encounter during its lifetime that I can start teaching it now? So we know that animals are likely going to have to shift. They're likely going to have to get weighed. They're likely at some point in their life going to have to be on an exam table. They're likely going to have to get an injection. They're likely going to have to get manually palpated during exams. So those are things that you want to start working up to before the animal needs it. So just in your daily training or your weekly training, or if it's a reptile, your monthly training, however often you're doing the training, you can start working up to those behaviors so that when the time comes that that actually needs to happen for real, it's no big deal for the animal. If you're trying to teach one of these behaviors and it's not happening, then you need to change your antecedent arrangement or change your reinforcer or change something about what you're doing. You're not going to keep trying to repeat the same process if it's not working. So that's where there's give and take with your learner, where you might have a training plan and you think, I'm going to use this reinforcer and this cue, and I'm going to set up the environment this way. And you try it a few times and it's just not happening. So now you need to go back and change. Well, maybe I can try this instead. Or how could I make the animal, like with the scale, when I was first teaching the snakes to shift onto the scale, I just had that white metal baby scale sitting outside the enclosure, and I'm asking them to shift onto it. And it's just a smooth metal surface that's white. And you also need to know what colors your animal can see. So pythons see colors in the blue-green color spectrum. Everything else they just see is shades of gray. So there's this white metal scale that's got no heat signature and it's just smooth. So there's nothing for them to grip onto. They don't really perceive the color well. It's cold, right? And I'm thinking, well, how can I make it more attractive to them to shift onto it? And that's when I made that scale station, which is a blue-green color. It's got some rubber grippy stuff on it. And I put a PVC perch across it. So now it's more attractive to that species because now there's something for them to climb onto. They can see it better. They can grip onto it and they can coil around that perch. So sometimes you just need to think about how can I make this behavior more attractive for the animal to do. Now, if you have to do a veterinary procedure and the animal's not trained yet, or you've been training them, but they're just not ready, then you just have to do it in the most effective way possible for that animal at that time. Another example with snakes is I've got one snake here that's trained to station for an injection, that one you saw in the picture. But I had 2 snakes get respiratory infections that weren't trained yet, and they needed injections. They couldn't wait to get their injections until after I did this whole long training process. So I just had to hold them and minimally restrain them, and try to make it as least stressful experience as possible and still give them the injections. So for the one snake, the least intrusive, most effective way to give an injection is to have him station and put his face on the target and hold in position while he gets the shot. For these other snakes, the least intrusive, most effective manner was to gently hold them and gently restrain them while I gave the injection because they weren't trained to do anything else yet. And so if you have to do a procedure, you've just got to make it work. And you still try to be as least intrusive as possible, but if they need the procedure, they need the procedure. So you're going to have to use some level of force. And that's another continuum that you will learn as you stay in this field, that just by having the animals under captive management, that is force. We are using force just by holding them against their will in captivity. But the force continuum is minimal level of force and a high level of force or restraint. And so you always want to strive for that low level of force and restraint. But if you have to get a procedure done for the animal's well-being, then you may have to increase that level based on how much training they have or haven't had. Hopefully that answers your question. I think that's what your question was alluding to.
Got a thumbs up. So, good question. Anybody else? We got time for maybe one more-ish, depending on.
And please, if you have questions that don't get answered today, this is my email and you're welcome to email me. And I'm also, there's a contact form on my website, but I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. And then on any of my YouTube videos, you can ask questions and I'll answer in the comments.
We'll put stuff up for my class, at least in the mod section of Sakai. So you guys have it there too. As well as like the PDF and stuff of her presentation. So any other questions before we let her get on with her day, her very early day? Or maybe
go back to bed.
No other takers? Dr. Barber, do you have any fun question?
No, just thank you so much, Lori. This was great.
Yeah. All right.
No problem. As soon as I sign off, I'm going to save this and I'll message it to you guys.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. No, thank you so much for waking up in the middle of your night and partaking. We really
are
appreciate
welcome.
it. So you've given them
Okay, well, I will. Yeah, I hope so. I feel like it's a lot of information in an hour when you consider, like when I got my degree, I had a whole semester of this and a whole semester of behavior. So you guys are getting it in an hour. So please feel free to email me if you have